Hey, hi, hello. Welcome to Diana Emerson. Today we're listening to the new detectives, Stranger Things.
Brutal murder, and all of the evidence suggests that the serial killer is responsible. As investigators struggle to identify a suspect, more bodies continue to surface. In Michigan, the pregnant wife of a promising young attorney is found dead in the couple's home. Though it appears to be the result of a tragic accident, police are not convinced. It falls to forensic examiners to expose the truth. Solving a murder requires a team of experts whose efforts often go unrecognized. When crime fighters meet crime writers, their story is finally told. And many times, it's a tale stranger than fiction. Bellevue, Washington lies just east of the city of Seattle. It's a thriving community of about 100,000 people who live, work, and play here. But in the summer of 1990, young women began turning up dead throughout the city. On Saturday, June 23rd, Bellevue police received a 911 call. A restaurant employee had stumbled upon the lifeless body of a young woman. Investigators responded to the scene. They found the victim lying among trash next to a dumpster behind the restaurant. She was nude, except for a necklace. Her arms and legs were positioned as if she were lying in a coffin. A pine cone rested in her hands. It was clear that the victim's body had been posed by the killer. Technicians managed to locate a single black hair near the woman, but they found no clues to her identity or that of her killer. Bellevue detective Marvin Skeen was assigned the case. He knew this wasn't going to be an easy murder to solve.
Most crime scenes, you know who your victim is. In this particular crime scene, we had no idea at all who our victim was, her identification. We also lacked clothing, so we couldn't provide a clothing description when we asked the public for their assistance in determining who the victim was.
The medical examiner concluded that the woman, likely between the ages of 25 and 35, had died as a result of strangulation. She had also been brutally beaten and sexually assaulted. In addition to collecting biological evidence, dozens of fibers clinging to the victim's body were also recovered. Though it wasn't much to work with, detectives forwarded what little evidence they had to the Washington State Patrol Crime Lab in nearby Tacoma. After examining the fibers under a microscope, all that scientists could conclude was that they had originated from the carpet or trunk mat of a car. Next, the black hair collected from the crime scene was analyzed, in the hopes it would provide some clue to the killer's identity. Forensic scientist Terry McAdam.
We can look at it for predominantly pigmentation helps us to decide which possible broad racial groups they belong to.
From the color, texture, and shape, McAdam determined that the hair had come from an African American male. But having been found among trash and debris, its connection with the crime was uncertain. Investigators knew the best way to find this killer would be to first identify the victim. But no missing persons reports filed in the city of Bellevue matched their victim.
We went to the news media, who, of course, were interested in the case, asked for their assistance. We also went to teletypes and bulletins to surrounding law enforcement agencies, asking them to check for missing individuals in their cases.
Soon after, investigators got their first break. In a neighboring jurisdiction, a woman reported her roommate missing. From photos taken at the autopsy, she identified the victim as her 27-year-old friend, Marianne Polright. She said that she had last seen Marianne 3 nights earlier as she prepared to go out for the evening. Marianne had borrowed her roommate's necklace. It was the same one found around the victim's neck. Marianne usually spent her Fridays at a bar just a few blocks from where her body was found.
The roommate indicated to us that Marianne's personality was one that was a free spirit, and that Marianne definitely enjoyed dancing, and that she would go to the various local clubs to dance. That was her main purpose as far as recreation. We learned that Marianne was a very hard worker. We learned that also from co-workers and from employers. But the roommate indicated to us that Marianne would not go with a stranger, someone unknown to her.
Following up on the roommate's information, police went to the bar where Marianne spent her Friday nights. The restaurant manager knew her well, and she had been there the night before her body was discovered. Though he hadn't noticed who she was with, he believed she had left in a hurry. Marianne had forgotten her sweater and purse. Investigators collected the items, hopeful they contained some clue to her killer's identity. But the evidence failed to yield any useful information. The investigation into Marianne Polright's murder was going nowhere. And the caseload for Bellevue detectives was about to increase. On August 9, 1990, police were dispatched to the home of Carol Beathy. Her ex-husband, Paul, had received a call from his 2 young children earlier that day. They said that their mom was locked inside her bedroom and wouldn't come out. When Paul came to the house, he discovered his 36-year-old ex-wife Carol dead inside her bedroom. It looked as though she had shot herself. When police entered the room, however, it became clear this was no suicide. Though a shotgun lay near the victim, it had not been fired. Instead, the killer had posed the victim's nude body and used the shotgun graphically as a prop. Carol Beathy had been sexually assaulted and beaten to death. But no biological evidence of rape was found. Technicians collected a few black hairs from the sheets. Though robbery did not appear to be a motive, family members later determined that Carol's heirloom ring was missing. For Bellevue homicide detective Dale Foote, the similarities between the Marianne Polright and Carol Beathy murders had to be more than coincidental.
Bellevue is a pretty quiet suburban town, and we don't have a whole lot of homicides here, so we have 2 cases with women that are openly displayed and posed nude. Yeah, we're having some questions. Why are these two cases so similar in nature? Is there any connection between them? Do they know each other? Do their friends know each other? Do they work together? Do they, attend some of these nightclubs together? We just didn't know. So some of those questions we had to answer and answer real fast.
To find out if the cases were in fact connected, police forwarded the hairs recovered from the Carol Beatty crime scene to the lab. When examiners compared those to the one recovered from the Marianne Polright crime scene, they concluded that the hairs had originated from the same person. Bellevue police were now faced with the possibility that a serial killer was loose in their city. Looking to find a common thread between the two victims, investigators began interviewing Carol Beatty's co-workers at a popular restaurant where she worked as a waitress. Carol's friends could not imagine why anyone would have wanted to hurt her. Though she and her ex-husband Paul were divorced, they maintained a great relationship. And Carol's two daughters constantly showered her with love and affection. Though Carol Beatty would sometimes go to nightclubs, police were unable to establish any connection between her and Marianne Polright. The two unsolved murder investigations quickly became front-page news. Soon, the mystery caught the attention of veteran crime writer Jack Olson. With 10 true crime novels to his credit, Olson recognized that as a writer, this story was too unusual to be ignored.
I think the thing that made this case unusual was the posing of the bodies. That is not seen. It is seen, but it's not seen very often. It represents some kind of a deep-seated hatred of women.
And Bellevue police feared that such a deep-seated hatred would not simply go away on its own. If they didn't identify a suspect in the killings, and fast, it would only be a matter of time until more victims turned up dead. Police in Bellevue, Washington struggled to solve the sexual assaults and murders that had claimed the lives of two young women. The bodies of 27-year-old Marianne Polright and 36-year-old Carol Beatty were discovered less than 2 months apart. Having found both victims savagely beaten, sexually assaulted, and their bodies posed after death, investigators had reason to believe that the murders were the work of one predator. But so far, they had no idea who that was or when he would strike next. On September 3rd, 1990, police in neighboring King County received a 911 call. The body of 24-year-old Randy Levine had been discovered by her landlady. She had been savagely beaten, and her nude body was posed suggestively in her bed. Technicians located a single dark hair near the victim's body. The only item determined to be missing from the room was an antique ring. At autopsy, the medical examiner confirmed that Randy Levine had died as a result of blunt force trauma to the head. Though she had also been sexually assaulted, no biological evidence was found. But the medical examiner did find evidence that the young woman had been tortured. 283 tiny puncture wounds dotted her body. The pattern of some of the injuries suggested that the killer had played a game of tic-tac-toe. Because the Levine homicide happened outside the city limits of Bellevue, its parallels to the unsolved Polright and Beatty murders might have gone unnoticed. But then, Bellevue Police Detective Ed Mott received a call from a paramedic who happened to be called to all three crime scenes, and he couldn't help but notice the similarities.
He says, I'm not a cop. I'm not a policeman. He says, but the last three murder cases I've been to, he says, it's really odd that the three bodies have been posed.
Bellevue police also learned that Randy Levine had been to a Bellevue nightclub the night before she was found murdered. There could now be little doubt that a serial killer had claimed the lives of all three women. Officers from throughout the area began pooling their resources, desperate to identify this killer before he struck again. The senselessness of the homicides left veteran crime writer Jack Olson struggling for answers. He wondered why these women in particular had been targeted for murder. He could find no rational explanation.
They were perfectly fine women doing exactly what we would expect decent young women of their age, 20, 30, 35, to be doing. They held jobs. They were responsible. Yes, they did go to nightclubs now and then. They're admirable people.
As the hunt for the serial killer intensified, an intelligence officer with the Seattle Police Department believed he had uncovered a possible lead. A few days after the Randy Levine homicide in King County, a man named George Waterfield Russell was arrested near a residence for impersonating a police officer. According to the reports, when 32-year-old Russell was pulled over for traffic violations, the officer saw him try to hide something under the vehicle. At first, Russell identified himself as an undercover police officer, but later recanted. Suspicious, the patrol officer searched his car. He located a police scanner, a buck knife, and 2 IDs. Hidden underneath the vehicle, he found a loaded handgun. A check of the serial numbers revealed that the gun had recently been stolen. Russell was placed under arrest for impersonating an officer and being in the possession of a stolen weapon. A records check showed that Russell had an extensive criminal record, which included sexual assaults and cat burglaries. Mostly, George Russell stole jewelry. A further background check revealed that Russell was known to frequent Bellevue area nightclubs, and he had a reputation.
Well, George was a charmer, and basically he was liked in the nightclubs. He was a popular man in the nightclubs. He had a good line of chatter. He would sidle over next to the DJ and they'd have a nice conversation, and then he'd sidle over to the bar and have a nice conversation with the bartender, and then various people, usually young women who came under his aura would sit with him, would buy him drinks, would tell him what a great guy he was.
Though that wasn't a crime, to investigators it went a long way in explaining how the three victims could have been manipulated into being alone with the killer. Detectives wanted to speak with George Russell about the murders. He claimed he didn't know anyone named Carol Beatty or Randy Levine. However, he admitted knowing Marianne Polright. In fact, he had seen her at a bar the night before she was found murdered. But he said they weren't there together and didn't speak. Recalling that fibers from a vehicle had been recovered from Polright's body, police asked for permission to search his car. Russell claimed he had borrowed a friend's truck that night. Eager to cooperate, he gave police the address of his friend who had lent him the vehicle. The man confirmed he had lent Russell his truck several months earlier. He added that when Russell returned the vehicle the following day, there were large stains on the seats, and the interior of the car reeked from a horrible smell. It was so bad, he scrubbed the truck clean later that day. For investigators looking for proof that George Russell was a serial killer, that was the worst news they could hear. Investigators in Bellevue, Washington, believe that 32-year-old George Russell was responsible for a string of brutal sexual assaults and murders that had claimed the lives of 3 young women. Now they needed to prove it. Police located the vehicle Russell had borrowed the night that the first victim, Marianne Polright, was killed, hopeful it contained evidence of murder. But in the days following the homicide, the truck had been thoroughly cleaned by its owner. But beneath the upholstery, technicians located a suspicious stain. It appeared to be blood. However, it was too degraded for a more comprehensive analysis. Fiber samples from the vehicle's carpet were also collected. At the Washington State Patrol Crime Lab, examiners compared the fibers recovered from the truck to those collected from the body of Marianne Polright. Though they were consistent with one another, supervising forensic scientist Terry McAdam knows that no analysis is perfect.
We can't say that that fiber came from that car because unless we can take out the exact fiber and match up its ends, we can't say that. What we can say is the fiber we found in a suspect's car matches that found on the clothing of the victim as regards to having similar microscopic characteristics. We can't say it's a match.
Still, the finding was enough to allow investigators to obtain a search warrant for the suspect's apartment. There, they found a gym bag filled with slips of paper with women's names and phone numbers written on them. Police contacted several of the women whose names were found in Russell's home. Most knew George Russell well. Though many had no idea how he got their phone numbers, they didn't feel threatened. Russell had told them he was an undercover cop. Homicide Detective Dale Foote.
We kept hearing these same stories about George working for the police and being an undercover agent and that kind of thing. George was very articulate, a very charismatic young man, and a lot of people bought into his story. And actually, the fact that they bought into his story kind of was a hindrance to us because they rather trust George than they would rather trust the police.
But one of the women contacted felt differently, and she had an interesting story for police. She said that recently, George Russell had given her an antique ring. It was his way of apologizing for sending her up on a date the week before. Though she had suspicions that the ring had been stolen, she reluctantly accepted the gift. Shortly after that, she learned Russell was a suspect in the murders.
When she began to hear that George was involved or possibly involved with these homicides, she became frightened. And she gave this ring to another friend of hers who just happened to be leaving town. He was on his way to Florida. And so he took that ring with him. And having arrived down there, a little short of cash, he went down to a pawn shop and pawned this ring. Fortunately, that ring was still there when we called.
Investigators confirmed that it was the same ring that had been stolen from Randy Levine's room at the time of her murder. Convinced they had the serial killer, investigators next looked to tie the suspect to the murder of Marianne Polright. Detective Marvin Skeen decided to take advantage of a new forensic technology called DNA testing.
At the time in 1991, introducing DNA evidence into court was the first time that it had occurred in King County in the state of Washington. So it was new, very new, and it was something that had to be looked at and a lot of time spent on to make sure that we did it properly and to get it accepted by the court.
It was time well spent. On January 10, 1991, examiners determined that George Russell's DNA matched the biological samples found on Mary Ann Polright. He was subsequently charged with her murder. Based on the hair analysis, he was also charged with the murders of Carol Beatty and Randy Levine. Police believe that George Russell used his abundant charm to lure women into his web. And once he had them where he wanted, he pounced on the unsuspecting victims. George Waterfield Russell was convicted of the 3 murders. He was sentenced to 2 consecutive life terms, plus 28 years.
George is a professional listener, not because he really cares, but because that's the way he takes your defenses down and can do whatever he wants. Now, I spent 3 hours with George at Walla Walla Penitentiary, and I mean, this is one of the most horrendous killers that ever lived. But it was a delightful 3 hours. He's interesting on every subject. He's friendly. He smiles and he cracks little jokes. That's all the exterior. What there is beneath that, I don't think even George knows.
Shock value was part of George Russell's murderous plan, and he went to great lengths manipulating his crime scenes to achieve it. Oftentimes, the significant facts of the case lie just below the troubled surface. Just north of Detroit, Michigan, lies the city of Hazel Park. Its 3 square miles are home to 8,000 families, and in 1999, one ugly scandal. On the afternoon of Monday, August 16th, the Hazel Park police dispatcher received a frantic call.
What took place?
A man reported that his wife had accidentally shot herself. When the responding officer arrived a few minutes later, Michael Fletcher, a prominent local attorney, was waiting outside his home. His wife was inside. He had checked for a pulse, but she wasn't breathing. He led the officer to the bedroom where his 29-year-old wife, Leanne, lay on the floor. Following protocol, the officer kept Michael Fletcher from entering the room. But there was nothing anyone could do. Leanne Fletcher was dead, the result of a single gunshot wound to the head. Any shooting death, even an accidental one, is treated as a crime scene. And this one was no different. Crime scene technicians began processing the room, looking for evidence to help them reconstruct what had happened. They collected the .45 caliber handgun found inches away from the victim's body. Unsure of what to make of the findings, police began searching through the contents of the victim's purse, looking for a suicide note she may have left behind. But what they found was a greeting card from her husband. He was expressing his joy over Leanne's recent pregnancy. For investigators, all of the findings suggested the expectant mother's death had resulted from a tragic accident. Police in Hazel Park, Michigan, continued to investigate the tragic shooting death that had claimed the life of 29-year-old expectant mother Leanne Fletcher. The victim's husband, Michael Fletcher, was brought in to make a statement. The 29-year-old attorney couldn't believe that his pregnant wife was dead. Michael told police that after dropping off their 3-year-old daughter earlier that morning, he and Leanne went to a local firing range. He wanted her to learn how to properly shoot a handgun in case she ever needed to protect herself and the children. At first, Leanne was hesitant to handle the weapon. But according to Michael, she finally became comfortable and then fired a few rounds. When the couple returned home, Michael wanted to clean up and change clothes before heading off to work. He asked Leanne to load bullets into the clip and then put the weapon in its case that he kept by the side of the bed. The next thing he knew, he heard a shot and rushed out to find his wife bleeding to death. He was certain that the safety was on when he handed her the weapon. And he didn't remember that there was a round already in the chamber. As a matter of procedure, investigators collected the shirt Fletcher had been wearing at the time of the accident for testing. Though Michael Fletcher's account was consistent with an accidental shooting, as a matter of routine, investigators needed to interview the couple's friends and family members. When questioned, the victim's mother was upset and angry. She said she never trusted Michael Fletcher, and she was convinced her daughter's death was no accident. Nearly 6 months earlier, Leanne had complained to her mother she was unhappy in the marriage and wanted a divorce. When she confronted her husband, he was furious to learn she had gone so far as to hire a divorce lawyer. But soon after, Michael began trying to repair the marriage. He had just started to earn a substantial income, and the mother believed he was simply trying to avoid having to pay alimony. The information led investigators to take a closer look at Leanne's death. They forwarded the .45 caliber handgun to forensic examiners, believing it possible that the gun had misfired in the hands of an inexperienced Leanne Fletcher. Using weights attached to the trigger, they found that to successfully discharge the weapon, a significant amount of force had to be applied. It was unlikely that the gun would have accidentally gone off on its own. But that still left investigators with the possibility, however unlikely, that the expectant mother had taken her own life. At autopsy, medical examiner Dr. L.J. Dragovich looked for signs of suicide. Though large blood stains were found on the victim's hands, he could find no gunpowder residue or mist-like blood spatter, which are usually present with self-inflicted gunshot wounds.
There will be fine mist of blood created by the bullet impacting the skin and causing the wound. I would have been able to see evidence of that fine mist drop of pattern on the hand of the victim herself. That was not there.
When he examined the wound, He noticed that the size and shape of the powder burns, or stippling patterns on Leanne's head, were consistent with the weapon having been fired from less than 2 feet away. The bullet had entered from above and behind the victim's right ear. Based on his findings, Dr. Dragovich concluded that it would be nearly impossible for Leanne Fletcher to have held the gun in the position needed to account for the trajectory of the bullet.
It's very uncomfortable to try to self-inflict the injury in a way that you have to be a contortionist to be able to do that. In addition to having an arm long enough, this is not physically possible.
Though the findings were powerful, they didn't prove Michael Fletcher had killed his wife. Still, rumors began to circulate through the small community. Freelance writer Tom Henderson followed the story and conducted his own investigation. But as an outsider, he knew that uncovering the truth would not be easy.
I gathered the information by just basic reporting. You get used to, when you're a reporter, being outside your comfort zone, girding yourself up to knock on that door with people that don't really want to see you, saying, "Hi, I want to do a book about your family's tragedy. Will you cooperate?"
Slowly, people opened up to Henderson. Those close to the couple did not speak kindly about the young attorney. But they all agreed that Leanne was a supportive and dedicated mother and a wonderful human being.
Leanne Fletcher, by all accounts, was everybody's best friend, and that was one of the touching things. Is you would interview friends, sisters. Everybody said Leanne was my best friend.
Michael Fletcher was asked to come into the station to answer questions. Stating he had nothing to hide, he agreed, but only under the watchful eye of his attorney. He admitted to police that his marriage had been shaky, but over the past several months, he said that he and Leanne had managed to reconcile their differences. In fact, just 2 days before her death, Leanne prepared a special dinner for the family. She used the occasion to have the couple's daughter announce to everyone that there was going to be a new baby in the family. Michael was elated. Though he couldn't explain the evidence surrounding Leanne's death, he insisted he was still very much in love with his wife.
In the 4 or 5 months before the shooting, they were, by all accounts, the happiest that they'd ever been. She told her family, her sisters, her friends, that he was finally being the guy that she'd wanted him to be.
Though the medical examiner's findings had led investigators to suspect foul play, they struggled to find evidence to support that theory. Police went to the shooting range where Michael had taken Leanne on the morning of her death. The manager of the range recalled the couple well. He said he never saw the victim fire the gun. And despite her husband's persistence, she refused even to handle it. That contradicted Michael Fletcher's story that Leanne fired the weapon. Investigators theorized Michael had organized the trip to the shooting range in order to get gunpowder residue on his wife's hands before he shot her. If that were the plan, it failed. But for those following the investigation, the case against Michael Fletcher was hardly clear-cut. There wasn't a shred of hard evidence that proved Fletcher had murdered his wife. And there was no obvious motive.
Mick Fletcher didn't stand to gain anything financially from her death. There was no insurance policy. The house, in fact, was in her name, and her parents ended up being responsible for its sale. His family didn't get any of the proceeds. He didn't get any of the proceeds. There was no financial gain.
However, the medical examiner's findings were enough to allow investigators to obtain a warrant to search the suspect's house. Hidden in Michael's closet, they uncovered a secret stash of emails, photographs, and love letters. But the items had nothing to do with Michael's wife, Leanne. It appeared Michael Fletcher had a mistress. And more surprisingly, she was a respected district court judge. Police in Hazel Park, Michigan suspected that the shooting death of 29-year-old expectant mother Leanne Fletcher was no accident. While looking for evidence to prove that her husband, prominent local attorney Michael Fletcher, was responsible, investigators learned he had been having an affair with a respected district court judge. Detectives went to interview the 32-year-old judge. When confronted with the evidence, she admitted she and Michael had been involved in a romantic relationship for about a year. She said she last saw Michael the night before Leanne died. He had come by her house. Michael hadn't mentioned that Leanne was pregnant. In fact, he told his mistress that he and Leanne lived like strangers, and the only reason he stayed in the marriage was for the sake of his young daughter. His true feelings were for the judge. The judge, who was also married, was tolerant of the situation, at least for the time being. But she had one condition. If she found out that Michael was being intimate with Leanne, the judge would end the relationship immediately. Hazel Park homicide detective Thomas Clayman realized he had just uncovered a possible motive.
When Mr. Fletcher found out that his wife was pregnant, caused us to believe that she could not find out, the judge could not find out, because if they were having sexual relations per her, the relationship would be over.
Detectives soon learned that it was more than just an affair that was at stake for Michael Fletcher.
And he ruled it a homicide.
In her statements to police, the judge admitted that after she and Fletcher became involved, she had helped his career. She made him the court-appointed attorney in dozens of cases, more than any other local attorney. It translated into thousands of dollars of extra income for the ambitious lawyer. Crime writer Tom Henderson knew this story was as compelling as it was tragic.
This case is about a set of dynamics that you would only expect to come across in a made-for-TV movie. You've got the really good-looking young attorney. You've got the really good-looking vivacious wife. You've got the powerful, young, pretty judge. The triangle, the classic triangle. And you've got a dead woman on the floor. It just caught everybody's attention.
It shows that he knew she was pregnant.
Though police believed they had finally established a motive, they struggled to find solid physical evidence that could prove Michael Fletcher was a cold-blooded killer.
I want to make sure.
But there was one item that had not been tested. The shirt Fletcher wore at the time of the shooting. After reviewing the suspect's statement, Detective Clayman realized the shirt might contain proof of the young attorney's guilt.
He stated that he was not in the room when the gunshot went off. Prosecutors wanted that shirt to test for the possibility of blood, spatter, or mist being on that shirt. From the naked eye, the shirt observed to be clean or without stain. The human eye, you could not see any of the stains. It was then taken to Michigan State Police Crime Lab.
Under a magnifying glass, examiner David Woodford could find no traces of blood. But then, on the cuff of the right sleeve, he noticed tiny mist-like stains. Looking to identify the substance, Woodford placed the shirt under a stereo microscope. Under the high-powered lens, he determined that the minute stains were in fact human blood. Their mist-like pattern was consistent with being high-velocity blood spatter, which are produced by the blowback from a firearm. The evidence contradicted Michael Fletcher's claim that he was not in the room when his wife was shot. More importantly, the blood on the cuff put him within 2 feet of the victim when the bullet struck her head. Police finally had enough evidence to arrest Michael Fletcher. And it came just in time. When police arrived, they found the suspect near a camper parked in front of the house. Michael Fletcher was placed under arrest and charged with the murder of his pregnant wife.
The prosecution's contention is that this was a orchestrated, well-planned homicide that took months to carry out. He'd been nice to her for months. He'd been sweet-talking her, getting into her good graces. Bought her a car that morning, not because he loved her, because he needed an alibi. Took her to the gun range, not because he wanted her to share a hobby with him, but because he needed to get gunpowder on her hands.
But this case was not over. On August 19th, the day of Leanne's funeral, Michael Fletcher's lawyer was granted the right to a second autopsy by a renowned medical examiner. But he was at a disadvantage because the victim's body had been cleaned, embalmed, and her skull reconstructed. However, based on his experience and the size and location of the wound, he believed that it was plausible that the gunshot wound had been self-inflicted.
Dr. Dragovich did the first autopsy, and his conclusion was pretty obvious. This is murder. This is not accidental or self-inflicted. The defense hired their own medical examiner. His results weren't conclusive at all, which is fine for the defense. They just wanted someone to say, this is not clear-cut.
But ultimately, those findings were not enough to create reasonable doubt in the minds of jurors. The evidence suggested that when Michael Fletcher learned his wife was pregnant, he realized that his relationship with his mistress would be destroyed. And there was too much at stake to simply let that happen. After returning from the firing range, Michael saw his opportunity and took it. Michael Fletcher was convicted of homicide in the second degree and sentenced to life in prison. Murder is the most senseless of human tragedies, and strangely, the most compelling. Writers are compelled to write about it. Readers are compelled to read of it. And though forensics can never explain why someone is driven to kill, it can provide us with the satisfaction of bringing the guilty to justice. In Hawaii, investigators find a body inside a makeshift coffin. But to find the killer, they must first rely on insects to help them identify the victim. A body is discovered under a pile of curbside trash in Oklahoma. Though police identify a suspect, it falls to a bug expert to prove murder. In Mississippi, a young family is found brutally murdered in a rural home. To expose a killer's guilt, Examiners must find a way to establish when they died. When a killer leaves no trace of himself at a crime scene, investigators can turn to the insects left behind for answers. Forensic entomologists can find justice for the victims of homicide by following the trails of predators and parasites. In this episode, some of the names have been changed. On October 24th, 1994, a man driving along the old Cali Highway in Oahu, Hawaii, noticed something lying in the woods just off the road. As he approached the object, he realized it was a large toolbox. Curious as to what he had found, he pried the box open. Inside were the badly decomposed remains of a human body. He called 911. Officers and forensic technicians from the Honolulu Police Department responded to the scene. Blunt force trauma on the skull indicated this individual had been murdered. No form of identification was located near the male victim's remains. Hundreds of insects were found in and around the makeshift coffin. Having found little evidence to tell them who this victim was or when he had been murdered, investigators contacted renowned forensic entomologist Dr. Lee Goff. As an expert in insect growth and development, Dr. Goff analyzes bugs found on a corpse and estimates how much time has elapsed since a person's death. In the toolbox, he found over 250 species of insects, including a colony of long-legged ants that had nested inside the victim's skull. After collecting dozens of samples, he returned to his lab at the University of Hawaii. An examination of the skeletal remains revealed that the male victim was between 50 and 60 years of age and approximately 6 feet tall. Damage to the skull was consistent with injuries caused by massive blunt force trauma. Other than observing that the victim had extensive bridge work done on his teeth, no other identifying features were found. Investigators began searching through previously filed missing persons reports, looking for a match with their victim. Though there were a few potential matches, homicide detective Hal Fitchett knew that until they could be certain of the man's identity, solving this case would be nearly impossible.
In all homicide cases, you've got to make identification of the body or skeletal remains in any case to make it solid for a jury to understand that this was a victim, and this is how he died, and this is who he was and how it happened.
In order to firmly establish the male victim's identity, investigators first needed to determine when he died. Dr. Lee Goff believed that the insects found in the makeshift coffin held the answers.
Typically, what we look at are life cycles of individual insects or succession patterns of insects onto the body. As the first fly lays its egg and starts the clock, the eggs hatch, the maggots begin to feed on the body, they change the body. And as they do this, they make the body attractive to yet another group of insects, and you have successive waves of insects invading this particular body, each one utilizing a different part of the body.
Among the various insects found, Dr. Goff identified the black soldier fly. Entomological research has shown that the black soldier fly will not become attracted to a body until decomposition has been underway for at least 30 days. But Dr. Goff also located newly hatched fly larvae, or maggots, that had come from the black soldier fly. Knowing it takes an additional 60 days from the time the soldier fly arrives to the time its eggs hatch and begin to mature into adults, he concluded that the victim had been deceased for at least 90 days. But the presence of the ant colony inside the skull indicated the victim had been dead much longer.
The ants were there basically looking for a somewhat dry place in which to establish a colony. They were looking at a protected type of an environment, a good place to establish the colony. And they're primarily just as a shelter, as opposed to using the body as a food source.
To determine when this victim died, Dr. Goff now needed to determine how long the ant colony had been present inside the toolbox. He began research into how ant colonies grow and develop.
You're going to find several different forms that are going to be present within the colony, each one doing a different job. Initially, you're just producing workers, servicing the queen, making sure the colony is maintained, obtaining food. But then you reach a certain colony size. And at that point, this colony is large enough that they want to look at establishing other colonies.
Generally, a colony reaches that size in 12 months. Then the queen begins producing other reproductive ants. Dr. Goff found such ants, identifiable by their wings, which allow them to leave the colony and go on to form their own. Knowing that the ants had not arrived until the soldier fly larvae began to hatch, Dr. Goff estimated that the victim had been dead about 15 months. But then, he factored in additional time it would have taken for the insects to penetrate the toolbox. Ultimately, he estimated the victim died 18 months before his body was discovered. Using Dr. Goff's analysis, investigators were quickly able to identify a missing persons report filed 18 months earlier that closely matched their victim's description. They contacted the man's family members. The children told police that their father, 55-year-old Charles Osborne, had disappeared in April 1993. They had last spoken with him on the phone shortly before he disappeared. Charles, a father of 3, was the co-owner of a marble and tile installation business. He was described as a dedicated craftsman who took great pride in his business and the quality of his work. The family didn't believe he would have just walked away from his livelihood. Co-workers said that they last saw him at a job site in Waikiki, where he was in the process of remodeling condominiums. Photographs of Charles Osborne were handed over to police. Looking to verify that the victim found in the toolbox was in fact Charles Osborne, investigators forwarded the photograph and the skull to the nearby United States Army Central Identification Laboratory. There, forensic anthropologists have spent years trying to match human remains found around the world to military personnel who have been classified as missing in action since the Second World War. To identify the remains, Dr. Robert Mann uses a process called video superimposition. Using photographs of a missing serviceman, examiners use video cameras to generate an image of the face. The image is then projected onto a monitor. Then, the face is superimposed onto a video image of the unidentified skull. Guided by the spatial arrangements that make each person's face unique, examiners look to see if the bone structures line up with the contours of the face in the photograph.
You take the skull that is recovered from a site, and then you take a photograph of the individual who you think it could be. And using two different cameras, you overlay those images, and you match up the bony landmarks beneath the skin with the features that you see above in the skin overlying the bone.
Using photographs of the skull found in the toolbox and pictures of Charles Osborne, examiners looked for similarities. Using the extensive dental work as their guide, examiners found a perfect match with the suspected victim. The man found murdered inside the toolbox had been positively identified as Charles Osborne. Now, investigators needed to find out who had put him there and why. By analyzing the insects recovered from a crime scene, forensic entomologist Dr. Lee Goff had helped authorities identify decomposed human remains. The 55-year-old contractor Charles Osborne had been murdered 18 months before, and his body hidden inside a toolbox. Now, police in Honolulu, Hawaii struggled to identify his killer. Looking to retrace the victim's movements prior to his death, investigators tracked down other contractors who worked with Osborne around the time he disappeared. They recalled that the last time they saw him, he had gotten into a heated argument with his business partner. While working to remodel condominiums in Waikiki, his partner, a longtime friend Ross Horton, said he needed more money to finish the job. Osborne refused. In fact, he accused Horton of using company money to purchase drugs. Ross Horton denied the accusation and then stormed off the job site. When they returned to the condos the following day, there was no sign of Charles Osborne. However, they noticed a pool of reddish-brown liquid on the floor. Believing it to be some sort of cleaning solution, they thought nothing of it. The construction workers agreed to accompany investigators to the former job site in Waikiki. Though nearly 2 years had passed, they hoped to uncover evidence of murder. Criminalists began searching the residence. Though the floors had been tiled over and the walls painted, technicians managed to locate a few minute traces of what appeared to be human blood. The samples were collected and sent on for a more detailed analysis. In the lab, examiners compared the genetic profile of the blood found in the apartment to known samples of the victim. They matched. Something violent had happened to Charles Osborne inside that condo. And for homicide detective Al Fitchett, all of the circumstantial evidence pointed to Ross Horton.
So now the objective was to locate Ross Horton. And we contacted individuals here with the state of Hawaii, and they were able to give us possible potential addresses where Mr. Horton may be residing. So I did follow up with those areas, and I did locate an address.
Ross Horton was ultimately tracked down to an address in Oakland, California. Police there were notified, and when Horton showed up for work, he was taken into custody. Honolulu detectives traveled to California to interview the suspect. Horton was shocked that after so much time, police were able to identify Charles Osborne's remains. Confronted with the evidence against him, Horton confessed to the murder. Horton said that after the other contractors had left the job site the day he and Osborne argued, he returned to confront his partner. He needed money to buy drugs. But when Osborne refused to give him more company money, he became enraged. The confrontation escalated into a fight, which quickly spiraled out of control. Later that evening, to conceal his crime, Horton placed Charles Osborne's body inside his toolbox and disposed of it off the side of a highway. The jury found Ross Horton guilty of second-degree murder and sentenced him to life in prison. With the help of Dr. Lee Goff's insect analysis, authorities were able to identify the victim and his killer. In Oklahoma, investigators must also rely on bugs, but this time to disprove a murder suspect's alibi. On the morning of August 8, 1993, in the small town of Stroud, Oklahoma, a resident on her way to work suddenly became overwhelmed by a foul odor. It was coming from a large pile of trash in front of her neighbor's home. She examined the garbage, concerned about a potential health hazard. Then, she noticed a human hand protruding from the debris. She quickly called 911. Dispatchers learned that the residence where the body was found belonged to 44-year-old Lito Cisneros and his wife, Linda Howell. When police arrived, they began rummaging through the trash. Under the mountain of debris, wrapped in a blanket, investigators found the lifeless body of a middle-aged man. From cuts and bloodstains on his t-shirt, it was clear he had been stabbed to death. Technicians collected all of the garbage, including fly larvae that had covered the body. Neighbors confirmed that the victim was in fact Lito Cisneros. And they hadn't seen his wife, Linda Howell, or Lito's vehicle in some time. Fearing there could be more victims inside, investigators cautiously made their way into the house. No one, including the victim's wife, appeared to be home. Agent Jackie Johnson of the Oklahoma Bureau of Investigation worked the case.
When we entered the house and we couldn't locate Linda, who we had been told also lived there, we were very concerned for her welfare because the car had been missing, so we were also afraid that she was a victim.
Their fears appeared to be well-founded. In the kitchen, there were signs that a violent struggle had taken place. Technicians found blood spatter on the wall and floorboards. And hidden beneath the refrigerator, investigators located a steak knife. The evidence was collected and sent to the crime lab for processing. Oklahoma authorities were faced with a dead body and a missing woman. An APB was immediately put out on Lito's vehicle. Investigators knew that if they didn't come up with answers, and quickly, more victims could turn up. Authorities in Stroud, Oklahoma, had few clues in the murder of 44-year-old Lito Cisneros, whose body was found under a pile of trash in front of his home. With the victim's wife and the couple's vehicle unaccounted for, authorities struggled for answers. At autopsy, the medical examiner determined that Lito Cisneros had died as a result of multiple stab wounds to the head and chest. A knife with a 5/8 of an inch wide blade had caused the fatal injuries. The level of decomposition indicated that Lito had been dead a few days. But with the additional insect activity, it was difficult to pinpoint a specific time of death. Further examination failed to yield any clues to the killer's identity. Police turned to forensic examiners at the Oklahoma State Bureau of Investigation's crime lab. There, examiners scrutinized the knife found hidden under the victim's refrigerator for clues. The blade measured 5/8 of an inch wide, the same dimension as the weapon that caused the fatal injuries. But technicians could find no traces of blood on the blade. The handle had been wiped clean of fingerprints. Desperate to generate a lead, investigators began interviewing local residents. One recalled seeing Lito at a bar on Thursday, August 4th, 4 days before his body was found. And she said he wasn't alone. According to the witness, Lito and his wife Linda Howell got into a heated argument. And that was not unusual. Linda began screaming at her husband, humiliating him in front of the other patrons. The witness also overheard Linda threatening to kill Lito before she stormed out of the bar. Lito followed her out and never returned. The witness had not seen Lito since that night. But she had seen Linda Howell heading out of town in Lito's car a few days later.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure.
Suddenly, investigators were no longer concerned that the victim's wife was in any kind of danger. Agent Jackie Johnson.
We found that Linda had been seen 2 or 3 days following Lito's last sighting, and therefore we were aware that she was okay, and she had also been seen in Lito's car. The fact that she had left town made us suspicious that she might have been involved.
But efforts to locate her and the missing vehicle had been unsuccessful. Then, a week later, a farmer in a nearby county found an abandoned vehicle parked on his property. A check on the license plates revealed that it belonged to Lito Cisneros. And according to the farmer, it had only been there a day. Linda Howell had to be close by. Within hours, authorities learned that Linda had friends that lived close to where the vehicle had been abandoned. The area was put under surveillance. A short while later, the tactic paid off. Police spotted a car passing through the small town. And sitting in the passenger seat was a woman fitting Linda Howell's description. When questioned, the woman woman identified herself as Linda Howell. She was taken into custody and then transported back to Stroud, Oklahoma. When questioned, Linda admitted that she and Lito had gotten into a fight at the bar on Thursday evening, August 4th. But she claimed she and Lito had made up by the following morning. In fact, things were going well between them. But on Saturday, August 6th, her ex-husband, Lucky Lee Lancaster, showed up at their house unexpectedly. Lancaster wanted to get back together with his ex-wife.
I didn't hear anything, and so I believed him.
When the two men began to argue, Linda took off. When she returned a short while later, Lucky was standing in the kitchen, holding a bloody knife. He had killed Lito during the fight. Linda Howell was placed under arrest for her role in covering up the murder.
Decide to answer questions now without your lawyer being present.
She believed that after the murder, her ex-husband returned home to California.
We contacted Lucky's parents, and they were very accommodating and giving us an address where we could contact Lucky in California. We contacted the California officials, and they located him on the beach and actually brought him in for us to speak with.
Authorities traveled to San Clemente, California to speak with the suspect. They learned that for the past several months, Lucky had been living in a homeless shelter. Under questioning, he insisted he had not spoken to Linda Howell in more than a year and denied that he was recently in Oklahoma. A review of the shelter's records corroborated his statements.
He would sign in for his food every day and show an identification. And by checking those records, we were able to establish that he'd been in California 6 to 7 months and had not left California prior to the homicide.
That meant Linda Howell's story was a lie. Now she explained her marriage to Lito was rocky, and without an alibi, she knew she would be blamed for her husband's death. She said the last time she saw Lito was on Saturday morning, August 6th, when he left town to visit some friends. When he hadn't returned by the following day, she decided to visit friends of her own in a nearby county. It seems someone was trying to frame her for the murder. Investigators weren't buying the story. To prove that Linda had killed her husband, investigators needed to establish that Lito was already dead on August 6th, the day Linda claimed she last saw her husband alive. The only evidence authorities had to firmly establish a time of death were the insects collected from the victim's body. The bugs were sent to forensic entomologist Dr. Neil Haskell, a professor at St. Joseph's University in Rensselaer, Indiana.
The Oklahoma Bureau of Investigation investigator, Jackie Johnson, had collected entomological evidence, primarily maggots from the decedent's body. We can use those maggots, larvae of a particular species of fly, to estimate how long the body's been there based on the growth and development of these insect life stages.
Dr. Haskell has spent the last 18 years researching the relationship between insects and decomposing human remains. To understand that relationship and to determine the life cycles of insects on a corpse, most of his studies have been done using pigs that have died of natural causes.
Pigs are readily available anywhere in the world. And many of the pig organs and tissues are almost identical to the human organs and tissues. So we find that it is a very adequate model to, and probably the closest animal we can find, and we find relatively no difference in the rate of decomposition of humans and pigs, nor do we find any difference in the insects or the sequence of insects that are attracted to both humans and pigs.
Based on those studies, Dr. Haskell concluded that the common blowfly larvae collected from the crime scene were in the third stage of development, meaning they were very close to becoming adult flies. But to determine how long it took them to reach that stage, Dr. Haskell consulted the weather data for the days leading up to the discovery of the body. Heat speeds up the development process. Cold slows it down. He found it hadn't been warm enough from August 6th to August 8th to account for the advanced stage of development. That meant Lito could not have died on August 6th, as Linda had claimed. His death likely occurred more than 90 hours before he was discovered, which would put the murder in the late evening hours of Thursday, August 4th, the night Lito and Linda fought at the bar.
Entomologically, this was very easy to prove because we had fully mature third stage maggots and we had the temperatures available for their growth and development, and it was very consistent with more of a 96-hour interval time of death rather than the 36-hour interval. And so we could refute the 36-hour interval as not being true. And we went with the 96-hour interval, which was consistent with her being with her husband, the decedent, at that time, and him dying shortly after she was with him.
Okay.
Dr. Haskell contacted Agent Johnson with his findings. Linda Howell was subsequently charged with murder. Police believe that after arriving home from the bar on Thursday evening, August 4th, the fight between Linda Howell and Vito Cisneros escalated. After stabbing him to death, Linda dragged his body to the curb, covered him with debris, and left him with the garbage to be picked up in a few days. Based on Dr. Haskell's analysis, Linda Howell pled guilty to second-degree murder and was sentenced to 25 years in prison. An hour's drive from the Mississippi state capital of Jackson, the rural community of Summit offers an escape from bustling city life. It's a sleepy little town, and in 1993, it seemed an ideal place for one family to spend some quality time together. On the evening of December 16th, police received a frantic 911 call. A man reported that he had discovered his family dead inside his remote vacation home. Officers from the Pike County Sheriff's Office and from the Mississippi Highway Patrol were dispatched to the scene. "50-year-old Michael Rubenstein told the officers that when he hadn't heard from his 24-year-old stepson, Darrell Perry, in some time, he drove from his Louisiana home to check on him. When he entered the residence, Michael found Darrell and Darrell's 22-year-old wife, Annie, dead. Annie's 4-year-old daughter, Crystal, was also dead. When detectives made their way into the residence, they were immediately struck by the smell of natural gas. In the living room, police found the badly decomposed bodies of Darrell and Annie Perry. In an adjacent bedroom, police found the lifeless body of Crystal lying in her bed. Police removed the bodies and sent them for autopsy. The following day, investigators from the Mississippi Highway Patrol began looking for clues to explain the deaths. Aside from the smell of natural gas, Detective Alan Applewhite was left with few answers.
Due to the state of decomposition, there was no way that we could determine the cause of death. The room was not disturbed in any means. It didn't look like there'd been a struggle. We had two victims in a den area with nothing out of place.
Police turned to the medical examiner for answers. The level of decay and the development stage of insects observed on the bodies suggested the family had been dead at least 2 weeks. That meant they had likely died in early December. Believing a gas leak inside the residence was responsible for the deaths, the coroner began a more detailed analysis. Almost immediately, he realized these deaths were not accidental. Both Darrell Perry and 22-year-old Annie had died from multiple stab wounds. Crystal had been strangled. The young family found dead inside an isolated Mississippi vacation home had been brutally murdered. After autopsies revealed that a family of 3 had been the victims of homicide, police in Clayton County, Mississippi returned to the remote vacation home where the bodies had been discovered. Now they were looking for clues that would lead them to the killer. But investigators found no signs of forced entry, and all the windows were securely shut. Technicians processed every surface, hoping to find any fingerprints that may have been left behind. But they found none. Whoever had committed these murders had been very careful not to leave any traces behind. The lack of any signs of a violent struggle or forced entry led investigators to suspect that the victims likely knew their killer. Hopeful the victim's family could provide useful information, investigators traveled to Louisiana to interview Darrell Perry's mother, Doris, and her husband, Michael Rubenstein, who had discovered the bodies. Michael explained that he had driven the family to his remote Mississippi retreat in early November. His stepson, Darrell, and Darrell's wife, Annie, had recently gotten back together after a long separation. Annie's young daughter from a previous marriage desperately needed a father figure in her life. For her sake, Darrell and Annie wanted to make the marriage work. They hoped some quiet time together as a family would make them closer. Michael offered to let them stay at his Mississippi residence. He said he last spoke to Darrell by phone on November 16th. According to Darrell, everything was going fine. But after a month went by without a word, Michael returned to the residence on December 16th. That's when he discovered the bodies. The Rubensteins told police that while Darrell and Annie were separated, Annie had dated a reputed drug dealer named Tony Harris. Harris was rumored to be a violent man. Police quickly located the suspect and brought him in for questioning. But Tony Harris denied any knowledge of the murders. And he had a solid alibi for the first week of December, when the murders had likely occurred. He later agreed to take a polygraph test, which indicated he was telling the truth. The investigation ground to a halt.
12. That's about 12:50.
How you doing, Mr. Perry? Nice to meet you.
Then, a few days later, Darrell Perry's brother David came in to speak with police. David believed their stepfather, Michael Rubenstein, had committed the murders. He said that he, Darrell, and their stepfather had been involved in insurance scams for years.
4-year-old girl named Crystal.
And from past experience, David believed that Michael Rubenstein would have no problem killing for money.
Out on one of his businesses.
David gave information that Rubenstein and he and Darrell and other family members had been involved in over the years, that Rubenstein primarily made a living off of insurance scams. He told us of a death where a hunting accident where a partner was killed back in 1979.
Following up on the lead, investigators reviewed the case files for the 1979 death of Rubenstein's business partner. According to court documents, the business partner was killed during a hunting trip when Rubenstein's gun accidentally misfired. No criminal charges were ever brought. But 2 weeks before the accident, the partner had made Rubenstein a beneficiary of his life insurance policy. But when Rubenstein tried to collect on the policy, the insurance company refused to pay. He decided to take the insurance company to court.
Your Honor, one never knows when tragedy is going to strike, and the city and...
But the law stated that if the policyholder dies within 2 years of signing the paperwork, the insurance company is not required to pay.
Witnessed the shooting. There are some...
Rubenstein was reportedly furious at the decision. Believing they were closing in on a suspect and a motive, detectives began interviewing other family members. They learned that Rubenstein had taken a $250,000 life insurance policy on 4-year-old Crystal. And the policy was dated 2 years and 2 months before the young girl was found murdered. Though incriminating, it didn't prove murder.
We knew now of the motive, which was a $250,000 life insurance policy, and it was just not enough for the DA to accept the case.
When Mississippi police reviewed witness statements, however, they found something that had previously gone overlooked. Several residents who lived near the vacation home where the victims were found murdered had seen Rubenstein in town on November 16th. The suspect previously claimed he hadn't gone to the residence until mid-December, when he discovered the bodies. To prove murder, investigators needed to establish that the family died during Rubenstein's trip to Mississippi in mid-November, not in early December, as the coroner had indicated. And the only evidence detectives had were photographs of the insects taken at the crime scene. Authorities in Summit, Mississippi believed that a $250,000 life insurance policy had led 50-year-old Michael Rubenstein to murder his stepson and his stepson's young wife and child. Though the suspect had been seen near the crime scene on November 16, 1993, the coroner's report indicated the family had died in early December. To resolve the conflicting information and firmly establish a time of death, detectives contacted esteemed forensic anthropologist Dr. William Bass of the University of Tennessee in Knoxville. For more than 30 years, Dr. Bass has conducted research at a 3-acre facility known as the Body Farm. Using human bodies that have been donated for scientific research, Dr. Bass has become an expert in how individuals decompose after death.
In law enforcement, you're frequently called upon to determine the length of time since death. And to do that, you need to know what the decay rate is and what the decay sequence is in humans. So this is one of the things that I got interested in, is determining the length of time since death. And in order to do that, then you need to look at how the body decays, how long does it take for that decay to occur, what are the factors like temperature and the insects and so forth that help you to determine the length of time since death.
The larvae of the common blowfly observed in crime scene photographs were about 14 days old, suggesting the family died in early December. But that didn't tell the whole story. When Dr. Bass examined the remains and factored in the temperature data, he concluded from the level of decomposition that the victims had been dead a month before they were discovered on December 16th. After examining photographs of the home where the bodies were found, Dr. Bass believed he could explain the inconsistency.
I agree, the maggots are only 14 days old. But you've got two things going on at the same time. You've got these bodies decaying inside of a house. You've got the flies outside of the house. It takes the flies a few days to begin to get the smell. Hey, there's a dead body in there. Then they have to figure out, how do I get from outside inside so I can lay my eggs on this decaying body? Bill, this is Dr. Bass, University of Tennessee in Knoxville.
After weighing all of the evidence, Dr. Bass concluded these victims had been dead 25 to 35 days before being discovered. That put the time of death at mid-November, exactly when Michael Rubenstein had been seen near the residence. Based on Dr. Bass's analysis, Mississippi authorities now had enough evidence to arrest Michael Rubenstein. He was charged with 3 counts of murder. Police believe that when Michael's financial problems became too much, he began plotting to kill his family members and then profit from their deaths. On November 16, 1993, 2 years after taking out a life insurance policy on 4-year-old Crystal, he drove to the residence where Daryl, Annie, and the child were spending time together. There, he brutally murdered the young family. 50-year-old Michael Rubenstein received 2 life sentences for the stabbing deaths of Daryl and Annie Perry. For the murder of 4-year-old Crystal, he received the death penalty. Some killers are skilled at removing any trace of themselves from a crime scene. But nature has its own way of leaving clues behind. Forensic entomologists can kickstart a dying investigation and find proof of murder by uncovering evidence left behind by predators and parasites. Investigators find a clue they think will lead to a killer's front door, but instead find themselves heading down a blind alley. Now their most important evidence is withering before their eyes. When a man reports his wife missing, her abandoned car becomes the biggest clue. But it's the nosy neighbors who drive the investigation. 4 months into her marriage, the woman disappears. But when her body turns up, it's clear she was no runaway bride. Investigators must rely on flimsy evidence to bag her killer. For some lovers, marriage can be murder. Even though proving it may pose a challenge, killers can't divorce themselves from the consequences of their broken vows. In the early morning hours of December 28, 1995, Melinda and David McLean let themselves into the apartment of their sister-in-law, Becky Vargas. The telephone and electricity in her unit hadn't been switched on yet. Becky was separating from her husband and had just rented the Ogden, Utah apartment.
Becky?
She had told her husband, Stephen Vargas, that she was going to try to start organizing her belongings and would return in an hour or two. But that was several hours ago. Stephen had asked Melinda and David to check on her, since they lived nearby. Melinda, who was Stephen's sister and Becky's best friend, was glad to go. Though they didn't see Becky, all seemed quiet and safe, leaving them unprepared for what they found. Becky Vargas lay dead in the leaves outside the building. Even before the sun was up, the Weber County Utah crime scene investigation began its day processing the murder scene. The victim's blouse had been pulled up. At first glance, the condition of her clothes made her appear to be the victim of a random sexual homicide. But a closer look revealed the story was not so simple. Criminalist Russ Dean thought the scene might have been staged.
It was as if her body had been moved from one location to another. Her arm was under her body as if she'd been dragged. Her coat was removed and was under her body. The leaves were bunched up in certain locations around her arms and legs. And there was no other obvious indication of any type of sexual assault.
In fact, though the victim had suffered a head injury, most of the blood had pooled at her feet, suggesting she'd been turned around. Whoever did this had apparently tried to throw off the investigators. The forensics team documented and collected a set of car keys, a cigarette lighter, fragments of blood-spattered leaves, and most significantly, the apparent murder weapon, a broken flashlight stained with blood and entangled with hair. They spent 6 hours sifting through every inch of the area before they were satisfied. They determined that although the body had been repositioned, the victim hadn't been moved far. The only blood found was just a few inches from where she lay. Because the blood-stained flashlight was the most compelling clue, it was analyzed first at the Utah State Crime Lab in Salt Lake City. Investigators could see that it had a partial fingerprint on it, stamped in blood. According to latent print examiner Scott Spute, a bloody fingerprint can be even better than a smoking gun.
When we have a bloody fingerprint, for example, it's the victim's blood, it's not her finger, it's someone else's finger on the evidence. It's a crucial pinpointing item of the evidence in which we can identify someone being at that crime scene, leaving that bloody fingerprint behind at the scene as they left.
It would be bad practice to home in on that one print. The lab had to inspect the flashlight for additional prints. The obvious ones and the ones that remained invisible. It required two separate processes. Bloodstains, because they're not oily, can flake or rub off. To fix them in place, the flashlight was heated to 100 degrees Celsius for 10 minutes.
After I heat it on, I then put a stain on there, which is called amino-black, which reacts to the blood and makes it very visible, and oftentimes brings out areas of blood that were invisible prior to treatment.
To develop the latent or unseen prints, the flashlight was exposed to superglue vapor. The adhesive bonds to the moisture on the print, creating a durable shell that exposes and preserves it. Then, a fluorescent dye is applied, which adheres to the superglue. The latent prints shine under ultraviolet light. Testing revealed no other blood-stained prints. The original one, along with the latent prints, would have to do. Once a suspect was isolated, investigators were confident that the bloody fingerprint was all they'd need. While the clues were being scrutinized, Melinda McLean and her husband David went to the police station to give their statements. Melinda told police that she'd been best friends with Becky Vargas for 14 years. Becky had been married to her brother, Stephen Vargas, for 9 of them, but it looked like their marriage was coming to an end. As far as she knew, the split was amicable. Though Becky was having an affair that her husband Stephen Vargas may have suspected, there didn't seem to be a lot of tension between the couple. In fact, it was Stephen who had called the McLeans to look in on him after the police told him they had no officers available to check on his wife. David McLean, down the hall, told police a similar story. He said that Stephen Vargas had called him just before 11 p.m. the night before the murder.
Did Steve at all go over there?
Stephen was worried because she was away so long. The apartment had no lights. He said that he and Melinda stopped by. Though Becky's car was in the driveway, there was no answer. They went to a window to see if everything was okay, but stopped when they heard moaning. They thought that perhaps her boyfriend was there, so they left. They went to a payphone to tell Stephen that everything was fine. They told him what they had heard, then they left. David told police that out of curiosity, they drove back to Becky's a short time later. Now they were surprised to see Stephen Vargas's Jeep parked out front. Soon he appeared from beside the building, got into the vehicle, and drove off. David said that they caught up with him. Stephen was wearing his bathrobe and slippers. He told them he wanted to check on Becky himself, but asked the McLeans not to tell anyone who was there. When David revealed this detail to the police, Melinda reluctantly admitted it was true. David told police that Stephen called them once more early the following morning. He said that Becky still wasn't home and asked him to check on her again. That's when they found her dead. At autopsy, the medical examiner determined that the lantern found at the scene wasn't the actual murder weapon, but it may have been used to subdue the victim. From the shape of the wound, she was apparently struck down with a hammer or something similar. No such object was located. The killer was clever enough to carry off or remove some of the most incriminating evidence. Authorities hoped he'd left enough behind. At the police station, investigators continued to talk with the McLeans. Their detailed story seemed to pivot on Stephen Vargas. Then it took a more provocative twist when the police dispatcher told Detective David Wheeloff that Vargas was on the phone, but he wasn't calling about his wife.
She said that he was on the phone inquiring about his sister and his brother-in-law, and if they were in fact at the police station. And I told the dispatcher, yeah, that's who we're in here talking to. And if she would ask him if he would mind coming down to the police station as well.
Police told him about Becky's murder and said that his in-laws were fine, but he might not be because Melinda and David saw him at the murder scene. He admitted that he was there that night, just as the McLeans had said. He peeked in the window, but he heard and saw nothing. Because the window was right next to where the victim was found, Wheeloff didn't believe him.
If Steve had gone there to look and listen, I don't think it would have been likely that he would have not seen Becky lying just a few feet away.
His suspicious behavior and the eyewitness testimony by the McLeans was enough to get a warrant to search Stephen Vargas' Jeep and to collect his fingerprints and a blood sample. Investigators were after anything that could link it to the crime scene. They found nothing but minuscule fragments of leaves, and not even many of those.
Actually, I wish I could find one of those.
The Jeep looked recently vacuumed. They collected what they could, then returned the vehicle to Vargas and sent him home. The forensics team hoped they wouldn't need to rely on the leaves. Now that they had Vargas' fingerprint, they could compare it to the ones from the flashlight. Most of the prints did, in fact, match Stephen Vargas. But that made sense. He owned it. So the only one that really mattered was the one stamped in blood. The bloody fingerprint had a shape called a tented arch. Of the three features of fingerprints, loops, arches, and whorls, arches are the least common, and tented arches are rarer still. Only 5% of the population has them. Stephen Vargas was among that group. But the fingerprint on the flashlight wasn't clear enough to make a definitive comparison. Vargas might have left it, and then again, maybe not.
I cannot say he did not leave that print behind. I can only say it's not enough to identify it positively.
They thought the flashlight would illuminate the killer. Without it, their hopes of solving the case looked considerably more dim. Investigators working to solve the Becky Vargas homicide saw their most promising piece of evidence rendered useless. According to Detective Wheeloff, a case that had looked cut and dried now depended on very fragile clues.
After we lost the flashlight, about the last piece of physical evidence we had that we could try and do anything with were the leaf fragments that were recovered out of the Jeep.
If investigators could find specks of blood on the tiny fragments, they would support the idea that Stephen Vargas was close enough to the body to have tracked them into his Jeep. It fell to supervising criminalist Pilar Shortsleeve to analyze the minuscule samples.
Trying to see blood on a small piece of colorful leaf was difficult. We used a stereozoom zoom so we could get down and look very closely at the leaves, and then to kind of guesstimate if we had any stains, and then we would do some preliminary tests. Well,
Out of the 5 samples of leaves, Pilar Shortsleeve found traces of blood on 2, but she had no proof the blood was the victim's. She rushed the samples to a DNA lab for analysis, fearing it might already be too late.
Whenever blood or body fluids are left on soil or samples that contain a lot of possible bacteria, the bacteria begin immediately in destroying the sample. They destroy not only the cells, but they get into the DNA and start to break the DNA down.
It would take 3 months for the results to come back from the lab. Investigators had to bide their time, but they didn't do it idly. They had to assume that the results would be negative and began to build their case some other way. Police served a warrant to search Vargas's apartment. They were after the bathrobe and slippers he was seen wearing at the crime scene. If he had beaten his wife to death, surely they'd be blood spattered. Vargas left the clothes in plain sight, easy to find.
I heard that he was supposed to be wearing a bathrobe and a pair of slippers.
The bathrobe had been freshly laundered. The slippers had no trace of debris on them. That in itself was strange, considering he admitted walking outdoors in them.
It seemed like Stephen Vargas was one step ahead of us on getting rid of any physical evidence that might link him to the crime scene. It seemed like every step that we thought of to locate that evidence was foiled.
Robert? Yeah. But there was one clue he couldn't bury, because it was 375 miles away in Cheyenne, Wyoming. After several weeks of wrestling with his conscience, Vargas's half-brother, Robert Esquivel, called police to tell of a favor that Stephen had asked before Becky's murder.
Steve had asked him if he would come out here and kill Becky for him.
Police set up a phone tap in Esquivel's apartment and had him call Vargas to get him to talk about their previous conversation.
Steve had gone through this denying or not remembering that part of their conversation, that it had been a joke, and towards the end even got threatening.
Though it stopped short of a confession, Vargas had set enough for police to arrest him on January 11, 1996, for the murder of Becky Vargas. But they weren't sure they had enough evidence to convict him. 1 month later, the results of the DNA test on the blood-splattered leaves found in Stephen Vargas's Jeep came through. A comparison of the DNA from the blood on the leaves matched Becky Vargas's DNA.
The blood on the blood side must match Rebecca Vargas.
Now authorities were confident of a conviction. Based on the evidence, police put together a likely scenario. Stephen Vargas, angry with his wife for her infidelity and their upcoming divorce, confronted her in her apartment. They fought. It escalated. And he hit her with a flashlight, knocking her out. He moved her to the side of the house, thinking she was dead. He was wrong. He wanted someone else to find the body, so he asked the McLeans to check up on her. They mistook her death throes for the throes of passion. When they told Stephen, he returned to finish what he'd begun, using a more lethal weapon. Tiny fragments of leaves told the whole story.
Well, in this case in particular, we had this flashlight that had a possible fingerprint in it, in blood, and that would have been the piece of evidence that kind of closed all the loose ends, but it didn't happen. In this case, it was a very small piece of leaf that was found in a vehicle that had blood on it that came from the victim, and it was just the interesting and exciting part that something so small could be so integral in the case.
Stephen Vargas was convicted of first-degree murder and is now serving 20 years to life. The case of Becky Vargas began with the discovery of her body. But when a person just disappears, it's not clear that a crime has even been committed. In this story, the names of the victim and the killer have been changed. On the morning of July 31st, 1987, Dan Remington of San Diego, California, was taking his kids to the YMCA. En route, he noticed his wife's abandoned car on the side of the road. Not wanting to alarm his children, he dropped them off at daycare, then rushed home to call the police. The San Diego police dispatched an officer. On his way to Remington's house, he stopped to examine the vehicle. The car apparently had a flat tire. The doors were locked, and he could see no spare or any sign of 29-year-old Liz Remington. When the officer arrived at the Remington's home, Dan Remington told him that he last saw his wife at 10:30 the previous night when she left for work. After he saw her car at 7:30, he called the hospital where she was a maternity nurse. She hadn't shown up. Remington admitted that their 12-year marriage was rocky. They were discussing divorce, but hadn't filed the papers yet. Dan handed the officer a key to the car and granted permission to impound it in search of clues. While it was possible that Liz's disappearance could be logically explained, missing persons cases fell under the domain of the homicide unit. They had the skills to collect and preserve every piece of potential evidence found at the scene. They found nothing obvious to indicate foul play and towed the car to the police garage. Any overlooked clues would be preserved in case the car required a closer look. Detectives visited a nearby convenience store, thinking that Liz might have gone there after her tire went flat. The cook told them that she had been in the night before. She needed to break a $20 bill to make a phone call. He didn't know who she called. Police remembered that Dan Remington told them she hadn't called home. It seemed reasonable to believe she may have simply run off with someone else. Liz's sister told police that was inconceivable. She wasn't the kind of woman drawn from a failing marriage. No matter how bad things became, she'd never leave her children. Sergeant Dennis Brugos of the San Diego Metro Task Force found that was the consensus.
She was very devoted to her children and her family. She helped at school. She helped at Little League. And just not the type of woman who would ever walk away from her family.
Liz's sister told police it was strange that the spare tire was missing. Dan had changed the oil 2 weeks earlier and made a point of thoroughly checking the car, including the spare. Investigators took statements from the Remingtons' neighbors. Many spoke of the deteriorating relationship between Liz and Dan. The information was duly noted, but in terms of evidence that any crime had been committed, investigators had absolutely nothing. At the time of Liz Remington's disappearance, San Diego police were grappling with an apparent serial killer. Because there was no evidence that Remington had left against her will, these more violent crimes took priority.
There was no body, there was no weapon, and therefore she was simply one of many missing adults throughout this county. And at that particular time, there was actually a series of sorts that was going on where there was upwards of 40 women who were found murdered in the East County area. So certainly that would have precedent over a missing person.
4 years passed since Liz Remington's disappearance. Most of the murdered women were transients or prostitutes, so she was not considered one of the killer's victims. But when a task force was formed to look into the serial killings, her file came up too, and investigators realized she was still missing after all this time. The neighbors' taped statements and the detective reports were dusted off. Well before Liz's disappearance, they had kept a close eye on the Remingtons and helped Liz out whenever they could. Over time, friction between the couple increased, and neighbors grew concerned about her and the children. One even kept a log of what went on at the house after Liz disappeared. To demonstrate how the Remingtons' relationship had deteriorated, a neighbor told investigators about how Dan tried to sell Liz's car without her permission. According to the neighbor, Liz wasn't just surprised, she was furious. A huge fight ensued. He said that the only reason Dan didn't sell the vehicle was because Liz had the only key and wouldn't give it to him. But police recall that on the day Liz disappeared, Dan had the key to her vehicle in his possession. Police also learned that neighbors had reported seeing Dan Remington filling in a ravine in the back of his property with a bulldozer shortly after Liz's disappearance. They said that after her disappearance, they saw him visit that property every few days. He never ventured back there before she disappeared. Remarkably, because the case had never been officially closed, Liz's car had remained impounded all this time. Dan had sued to get it released, but lost. Technically, it was still considered evidence. Now it would be looked at more thoroughly. One of the first things investigators found were coins in the ashtray. Purportedly, Liz had been last seen by a convenience store clerk when she wanted change to make a phone call. The clerk's statement suggested she was okay. Now investigators weren't so certain, since she had ample change in her car. They contacted the clerk to interview him again.
That clerk at the convenience store actually said he wasn't real sure that it was her. So that helped us to establish the fact that we didn't really know for sure whether
But
she was there.
I gave you a pet. I petted you. Okay, now back. Stop. Stop. So you don't know when to stop.
He sent the flattened tire from Liz's car to Goodyear Tire and Rubber in Akron, Ohio. Their lab is designed to evaluate the causes of tire failure. The tire was examined on the rim.
Report was the tire was flat, still flat.
Investigators found no outward signs of damage, only a tiny puncture, which would have led to slow deflation. Once the leak was isolated, product analysis manager Chester Patterson took the tire off its mount and examined it more thoroughly. From the looks of it, the tire went flat after the car had stopped.
We saw no damage on this tire. We saw no reason to have alerted any driver in the vehicle that something was going soft or whether the tire was deflating. Because in order to do that, the tire is beginning to come apart, and you would see that damage on the tire itself, but we saw no such damage.
But he did see something he'd never seen in his 35 years experience. The tire removed from Liz Remington's car had been punctured from the inside out.
The tire had been punctured from the inside. See these two impressions, circular impressions, right under the punctures of the tire. And we noticed the rust that's contained in them, and told me that somebody had taken a nail and pounded it through the inside of the tire to cause that circular nail-head impressions on the liner itself.
He concluded that the tire had definitely been tampered with. 4 years after Liz Remington's disappearance, investigators had enough to get a warrant to search Dan Remington's house. They found nothing of significance inside. Outside, a different story. In the yard, police backhoe went to work excavating the filled-in ravine.
The backhoe was probably 2 or 3 hours into the job when it hooked onto a piece of chain link fence that was lying flat. The excavation slowed down. What we found underneath that chain link fence was a tire.
The tire was the missing tire from Liz's car, and underneath that tire, wrapped in sheets and blankets, was the body of a female. And the missing persons investigation became a murder case. Dan Remington was arrested and taken away. Officially, the body was considered a Jane Doe until a positive ID could be made. A forensic anthropologist determined the remains were those of a Caucasian female who had died of blunt trauma to the head. She had been in her late 20s to early 30s, about the same height as Liz Remington. It seemed like they had found what they were looking for, but the law required more proof than that. Forensic dentist Norman Sperber was called in.
Everything hinged on the teeth. Teeth are the most durable part of the body, and we fortunately had dental films from her dentist. We were able to take films of her teeth because they were in very good condition.
By comparing the shape and position of the victim's fillings and teeth with Liz Remington's dental records, Sperber was able to make a positive ID. Liz Remington had been found. Because the victim was discovered wrapped in bed linens, investigators believed that Dan killed her while she was napping before work. Afterward, he carried the body out to the ravine, buried it in a shallow grave, then rented the earth-moving equipment a short time later, piling on 8 to 12 feet of dirt. Then he drove to the scene and replaced the good tire with the one he had flattened. Next morning, he reported his wife missing, confident the police would never piece it together. His unwitting accomplice was a suspected serial killer who denied police department's resources. But the clues eventually resurfaced, exposing the crime. Though Remington's exact motive will never be known, authorities believe he couldn't bear the shame of divorce, or the fact that he'd lose half of his wealth and property. In October 1992, Dan Remington was found guilty of the first-degree murder of his wife. He was sentenced to life without parole. Remington went to a great deal of trouble to hide his crime. Others take an easier approach, which sometimes makes their crimes harder to solve. On September 21st, 1995, a body was discovered in a wooded area in Boise, Idaho. Plastic bags bound with duct tape encased the feet and head. From its state of decay, it had obviously been there several days. No ID was found. No attempt had been made to conceal the body. It appeared to have been hurriedly dumped there. Because of its position and wrappings, investigators couldn't even determine the victim's gender without disturbing an already disturbing scene. At this point, anything could be a clue, so the body wasn't unwrapped or inspected until it got to the morgue, where it was scrutinized under controlled conditions. The tape was carefully cut away, and the bags removed and preserved. The victim was female, around 60 years old. The coroner determined that she was strangled. She was most likely killed elsewhere, wrapped up, and transported to the woods where she was found. She fit the description of Wanda Kuzmicek, reported missing 6 days earlier. Wanda had been reported missing by her second husband, Ben Kuzmicek, when she failed to return from work. The couple had been married just 4 months. Both had retired from the large firm they worked for. Wanda took a job cleaning offices. You are beautiful. Ben, a Russian immigrant who had once been artistic director for the Idaho Ballet, now worked for a security company. After Ben reported her missing, detectives wondered if Wanda had had second thoughts about her second marriage and simply run off. But a check of her jewelry and possessions showed she'd taken nothing with her. That's never a good sign. And then her body turned up. The victim's car had not been found, so the bags she was wrapped in became the most important clue. Criminalist Cynthia Hill set to work examining them. It was all she had.
Well, in this case, we didn't have a murder weapon. There were no eyewitnesses. And the place where Wanda was found was not the murder scene. So all these things were playing against us.
Hill fumed the bags in superglue to bring out any fingerprints. The glue, contained in foil pouches, vaporizes and bonds to the print, preserving it. The print can then be dusted with powder to make it more visible. Then photographed to create a record. Bill found only one print on the bag around the victim's legs, but so far she had no one to compare it with. Ben Kuzmicek was called to the police station to provide a set of prints for comparison. In a murder investigation, it's standard procedure to get a spouse's prints. Usually, it eliminates the spouse as a suspect. In this case, that isn't quite how it worked out. The print on the bag matched Ben's. That didn't necessarily mean he had a hand in his wife's murder. If the bag had been taken from the victim's own car, Ben might have handled it prior to its use in the crime. The print was lifted from a portion of the bag where one would normally grab it. In terms of evidence, it wasn't enough.
These people are living together. They're touching objects that one another touch. You have to be able to find a fingerprint in a location where they wouldn't normally have touched, or it's in conjunction with another piece of evidence that puts them at the scene.
Hill still believed that the bag might contain more prints. Though she didn't have the technology to lift them, she knew that the Royal Canadian Mounted Police Crime Lab did. If prints were there, the Mounties could find them, or so she hoped. She carefully packed her bags, sent them to Canada, and awaited the results. While Cynthia Hill waited for the prints to come from Canada, investigators in Idaho found Wanda Kuzmichev's car. More than a week had passed since her body was discovered. The vehicle had been abandoned in a store parking lot 4 miles from where she was found. Police processed the vehicle for fingerprints. They raised 2 prints from the trunk lid. Their placement suggested they were left by the person closing the trunk. Inside, investigators found something surprising. Nothing at all. For Detective David Smith of the Boise, Idaho Police Department, that was a significant discovery.
In talking with family members, they said that she would always carry her Jehovah's Witness literature in the trunk. In fact, they said you could not put anything in her trunk because it was so full.
But the trunk wasn't entirely empty. Investigators found a single drop of blood. It belonged to the victim. Whoever had put her in the trunk had also left fingerprints on the gear shift knob. Prints on the trunk and on the gear shift matched Ben Kuzmichev. Investigators faced the same challenges as before. The car belonged to Ben's wife. It stood to reason that he could leave his fingerprints on it. Still, it seemed strange that his were the only clear prints found, especially since he told police that as far as he knew, Wanda was the last person to drive the vehicle. The evidence suggested that Ben drove it last, leaving behind the clearest prints.
Tests were conducted to show that in approximately 70% of all cases, the last person who drives the car and activates the gear shift lever will destroy the person's prints who drove the car prior to and leave their prints on the gear shift lever.
The prints made detectives 70% sure that Ben Kuzmichev was lying. That wasn't good enough.
I knew Wanda's stature in that she was 5'4" and 140 pounds. When I looked at the seat, it appeared to me to be back farther than usual for a woman of that stature to be driving the vehicle. So I placed a female of 5'4", 140 pounds inside the vehicle. She wasn't able to reach the pedals, which appeared to be in a comfortable driving position. Conversely, I put a male matching Ben's description, 5'11", 190 pounds, into the driver's seat, and they fit very comfortable.
The experiment provided more circumstantial proof that Ben was a liar, but it still didn't prove he was a murderer. By now, the Canadian Royal Mounted Police Lab had performed their tests on the trash bag used to wrap the body of Wanda Kuzmichev. The test, called vacuum metal deposition, is a state-of-the-art method for lifting difficult prints from plastic. The bag was placed in a vacuum chamber and then pelted with ions of gold, which cling to the plastic but not to the oily prints. Then it's exposed to ionized zinc, which clings only to the gold, leaving the print untouched and in contrast against the plastic. The process revealed a second print on the bag. According to Cynthia Hill, the position of this print was far more incriminating.
The second fingerprint that was developed using the vacuum metal deposition proved that he had a direct contact with that bag because the positioning of the hand was in such a way that he would be grabbing the plastic bag, wrapping the tape around Wanda, and he would be the only one that would be leaving the fingerprint in that position at that time.
In most cases, that would be enough to win a conviction. But investigators weren't so sure. Proving a spousal murder on fingerprints alone would be a hard sell. The prints and other evidence they gathered gave them enough to get a search warrant for the Kuzmichev's home. They found no signs that this was the murder scene. But they did find the Jehovah's Witness literature that the victim's family said she never removed from her car. The items presented more circumstantial evidence that Ben had been involved in the murder. By January 1996, 4 months after the crime, investigators were still building their case against Ben Kuzmichev. He began to feel the circle of evidence closing in on him, and he announced he was going back to Russia. At that point, police had no choice but to charge him with Wanda's murder. If he returned to Russia, he'd be a free man, beyond U.S. extradition. Though they had enough to arrest him, they weren't certain they had a solid case for murder in the first. Between the time of his arrest and the trial date, investigators continued to gather evidence against Kuzmichev. Under surveillance in jail, he couldn't make a move without authorities knowing about it.
We placed monitoring devices on approximately 17 phones inside the jail at the Ada County Jail. That gave us the ability to monitor his conversations as outgoing as well as whoever he was seeing as a visitor. The end result was that we received nothing that can be used in court. Nothing incriminating came about the phone calls.
But help came from an unlikely source. Kuzmichev had confided details of his crime to his cellmate. The prisoner, disturbed by Kuzmichev's lack of remorse, reported the details to authorities. He had nothing to gain by doing so.
Ben and his cellmate were watching TV one evening when the news media broadcast that we had located a witness who had told us that she had, in fact, sold Ben duct tape and trash bags. The inmate told us that Ben found this humorous, that he had, in fact, purchased from this lady, but they were not the ones that we were looking for that he used in the crime.
The inmate's information, though hearsay, provided one more strike against Ben Kuzmichev. Investigators realized they'd gathered all they were going to get. They weren't sure they had enough. But because Ben was likely to be released and flee to Russia, they had to take the case to trial. From what police could put together, 4 months after their marriage, Ben and Wanda's honeymoon was over. He had been dependent on her money, wanted to return to his homeland. She refused to go. Their animosity built, and Ben strangled her. He wrapped her body in plastic bags, emptied the trunk of her car, loaded her in, and dumped her in the woods. Then he abandoned the car in the parking lot. Based on the accumulated evidence, Ben Kuzmichev was convicted for the second-degree murder of his wife Wanda and sentenced to 21 years to life. For Detective David Smith, solving this case meant more than simply delivering justice.
You do become personally involved. I mean, this guy has come to your town, committed this heinous act, and now you have this grieving family that you want to do everything in your power to solve this case for. And that's how I personally take it, and I know any other seasoned homicide detective will tell you the same thing.
When spouse kills spouse, the clues are sometimes difficult to read, but the marriage of forensic science with good detective work can bring together what the killer had tried to put asunder. Police find a frozen body in the Arizona desert. The chilling discovery sends investigators searching for more victims. A small town, a brutal murder, and a killer who could be anywhere. When all leads are exhausted, the investigation focuses on a blurry surveillance photo. When a young mother disappears, detectives are left with few clues. But slowly, the evidence begins to point to a dangerous and twisted predator. A lack of clues may cool down a hot investigation, but there's no statute of limitations on murder. Months or even years may pass before forensics can spark a fire under these cold cases. On June 4, 1991, investigators from the Costa Mesa, California Police Department pulled up to an abandoned car on the Corona del Mar freeway. They were responding to a call regarding a missing person, Denise Huber, age 23. No one had seen or heard from her for almost 24 hours, and that wasn't like her. Denise's best friend had found her car on the side of the road while searching for her. Investigators examined it closely, but aside from a flat tire, nothing seemed amiss. The only personal article they found was a pair of pantyhose on the front seat. Denise preferred to drive without them. Though nothing in the car tipped investigators about what had happened, Detective Ron Smith concluded that Denise ran into trouble soon after she had pulled off the road.
What struck us as unusual about the scene and concerned us right from the very beginning was that very near to her car, there were emergency call boxes, there were pay phones, there were all-night convenience stores, none of which Denise went to call her parents or to ask for help. We knew right away that something was amiss, something was wrong.
The last person who saw Denise was her date from the night before. She had dropped him off after a concert. Denise never made it home. Bright, popular, just graduated from college, she wasn't the type to worry her parents by going along without a call or note. Her family and friends started to look for her the next morning. After recovering her car, the Costa Mesa police launched a massive search for Denise Huber. They notified law enforcement agencies across the country. They followed up every clue, every lead. Denise's friends and family put up posters and appeared on news programs begging for information. As the months and years passed, the tips dried up. But police kept Denise's case open and as active as they could.
Every day we would do something with the Denise Huber case. We would review old leads. We'd go over old reports again. We'd look one more time at the photographs. We never gave up, even though we never really had anything good to work with.
After 3 years, no one could tell her grieving family and friends what had happened to her. Denise Huber had simply vanish. Meanwhile, more than 300 miles away in Arizona's Prescott Valley, authorities were grappling with a mystery of their own. On July 9, 1994, a woman went to buy paint at the home of a man she met at a swap meet. While she waited for him, she noticed a padlocked rental truck with paint and chemical cans cluttering his yard. She thought they looked out of place for such a respectable neighborhood and wondered if any laws were being broken. Suspiciously, she called a friend who worked for the police. Her friend thought it sounded like a clandestine drug lab, which police find in the most unlikely spots. He sent investigators from the Yellow Pine County Sheriff's Department to check it out. The rental truck with the California tags looked like it hadn't been moved in months. The electrical cord snaking out of it and the paint cans all around reinforced the notion that this might be a local drug lab. Checking the tag showed the truck had been stolen. Armed with a warrant, police cautiously opened the apartment door. Inside was a freezer. Not knowing what it might contain, they suited up in protective gear. Plastic bags obscured the contents, but at the bottom of the freezer lay a pool of frozen blood. Carefully moving the bags aside, the officers expected to find nothing more than a deer. Instead, Lieutenant Scott Mesher uncovered a horrific mystery.
Initially, when we opened the black bags and could tell that we had a human, a frozen body with handcuffs behind the back, ice crystals. It was grim.
The homeowner still hadn't returned, so police ran the license plates on the white pickup, also parked in the driveway. The owner was identified as John Joseph Famularo. Within an hour, Famularo and his mother pulled up to the house. Sheriff's deputies took Famularo into custody, charging him with stealing the rental truck. They were anxious to find out more about the body in the freezer. Mrs. Famularo, who lived next door, told detectives that her son was a house painter, which explained the paint cans. She said the truck had been parked there about 2 months. She didn't know anything about the freezer or its contents, except that the electricity in John's house had been turned off for 1 day, and he had asked to run a power cord from her house to the truck. At the police station, Famularo was polite but uncooperative. He refused to answer any questions and asked to see his lawyer. Without any assistance from their suspect, investigators would have to rely on physical evidence at the scene to identify the body in the freezer and to find out how it got there. They charged Famularo with homicide. The next day, warrant in hand, investigators entered Famularo's house, hoping to find information about the victim in the freezer. In its frozen condition, they couldn't even discern the victim's gender.
Look through these things on the chair.
Famularo's house was crammed with his belongings. This was the home of a man who never threw anything away. If clues were here, they'd be difficult to find. After more than 2 weeks of searching, investigators found several promising clues. The first was a set of handcuff keys that matched the cuffs on the victim. The next clue took investigators by surprise. 2 complete Los Angeles County Sheriff's Department uniforms. In the garage, the deputies found 2 boxes marked Christmas, but there was nothing merry about them. Inside, officers found blood-stained women's clothing and a bloody hammer and nail puller. They also found a pair of women's shoes, their backs badly scunned, as though the woman who wore them was dragged. And that wasn't all.
We did locate numerous female identifications. That included social security cards, I believe some driver's license, and other identification, obviously raising the concern of maybe we had additional victims.
Yavapai County Police had to face the very real possibility that John Famularo was a serial killer. Arizona investigators looking into a murder had every reason to believe that there may be more than one victim. To test that theory, investigators brought in cadaver dogs to locate more bodies on John Famularo's property. The dogs, trained to detect the slightest whiff of decay, alerted their handlers several times. Officers dug up every spot and still found nothing. But they never completely gave up the suspicion that the killer had struck before. Police followed up on every piece of ID found in the Christmas boxes. Much to their relief, they found that each woman was alive and accounted for, except one from Costa Mesa, California. Her name was Denise Huber. To confirm her ID, Yavapai County forensic technician Mike Winnie lifted a thumbprint from the thawing victim and compared it with the one printed on Denise Huber's California driver's license. The prints matched, identifying Huber as the victim. To authorities in Arizona, the name meant nothing. But to Costa Mesa detective Ron Smith, it was the news he had waited 3 anxious years to hear.
The call I received from Lieutenant Scott Masher from Yavapai County was that he thought maybe he had a body identified as Denise Huber and asked us if we were familiar with Denise Huber. Well, of course, I almost fell out of my chair when he mentioned the name.
Now that she had been found, investigators in Arizona had to determine how she had been killed. Working with the frozen and decomposed remains presented a unique set of challenges to Maricopa County Medical Examiner Ann Buchholz.
In our environment, to examine a frozen body is very unusual. We deal 99% of the time with people who have been exposed to heat elements, and that is more our area of expertise than someone who has been in a cold environment. It took the body approximately 2 days to thaw where we could actually perform the internal examination.
On Friday, July 16, 1994, Yavapai detective Scott Masher and Costa Mesa detective Ron Smith, along with other officers, gathered in the medical examiner's lab to observe the autopsy. The cause of death was determined to be blunt force trauma to the skull, resulting in multiple fractures. To identify the murder weapon, investigators needed to evaluate the entire skull to see where and how the blows had been struck. They called in forensic anthropologist Laura Fulginiti.
How many days are we looking at here? Reconstructing a person's skull is very similar to doing a jigsaw puzzle. Essentially, you have about 50 pieces and you need to put them back into what you know to be the right composition.
It took Fulginiti 2 days to reconstruct the skull. never losing sight of the fact that this victim was once a person.
And I remember standing in this very room thinking to myself, how did you come to be in my sphere? This is not right. It's not natural for you to be here.
She determined that the victim had sustained more than 35 blows to the head. The wounds were consistent with the hammer and nail puller pulled from the box in Familaro's garage. To be certain, the lab ran tests. Technicians were able to establish a DNA profile from the blood residue on the nail puller. It matched the DNA profile taken of the victim's own blood. The match confirmed that they had found the murder weapon. To build their case, investigators had to retrace the events that led from the victim's abandoned car on a California freeway to John Familaro's freezer in Arizona.
It was very important for both agencies, the Yavapai County Sheriff's Office and the Costa Mesa Police Department, to work together and piece the evidence from California and Arizona to one case, one solid case, in order to successfully prosecute this.
The Costa Mesa Police Department gathered information on Familaro's activities during the time he lived in California. They learned that he had attended the Los Angeles Sheriff's Department Reserve Academy, but he couldn't make the grade and dropped out after just a few weeks. He kept his uniforms, which police found at his house. Further investigation led detectives to a warehouse at Laguna Hills, 12 miles from where Denise Huber's empty car was found. John Familaro had stored some paint and supplies in the warehouse, then moved everything out when he left the area in August 1992, 13 months after Denise Huber vanished. Investigators thought it was likely that Familaro had committed the murder here. They hoped to recover forensic evidence that would tie the killer to the crime and determine where the killer's trial would take place. Police searched the unit for evidence of the crime using luminol to expose traces of blood. Applied to a surface and viewed under an alternate light source, luminol reveals blood stains invisible to the naked eye, even traces left years earlier.
We found that the warehouse was huge, and I wanted every square inch luminol for blood. Almost the very last bottle in the very last corner that we looked, we sprayed luminol into the corner against the wall. And all of a sudden, the luminol just lit up. This bright glow showed us we found what we were looking for.
Technicians compared this blood to a sample taken from the victim in Arizona. They matched. The forensic analysis gave Detective Smith of the Costa Mesa Police the proof he needed to make the case.
The forensic science in testing the blood was absolutely critical. Number one, it established that the crime occurred in California, and that established jurisdiction. It also positively identified that blood as Denise. It put Denise at that scene.
Familaro never confessed. The forensic evidence spoke for him. The investigators had successfully matched the blood in the California storage unit to the victim in Arizona, and that placed the victim within deadly proximity of John Familaro. Authorities believe that he was pulled off the road with a flat tire. Spotting his prey, John Familaro approached him with the guise of lending. He abducted Denise Huber in Costa Mesa, California, the early morning of June 3, 1991. Familaro murdered her sometime later. He hid her body in a freezer, trucked it to Arizona, and kept it until police discovered his crime 3 years later. Juan Famularo was sentenced to death. He awaits execution on California's death row. Famularo hid his crime by keeping the body close to him. Other killers are not so conniving. They can be easily elusive. It was a December evening in 1990. Peggy Phillips wondered why her husband Dean was taking so long to lock up the laundrette they owned in Ozona, Texas. It was just next door. She found him lying on the floor, bleeding and barely conscious. Police and paramedics raced to save him. Peggy thought that Dean must have fallen and hit his head. But the paramedics could see that this was no accident. Dean Phillips had been beaten nearly to death. Peggy watched as the paramedics loaded her husband into the ambulance. It was the last time she saw him alive. Dean Phillips died early the next morning, December 26th. The cause of death? Blunt force trauma to the head. Investigators determined that Phillips had interrupted a burglary and paid dearly for it. They found only one hard clue, a single fingerprint lifted from a coin box left on the floor. They sent the print to the Texas Department of Public Safety. Like small-town police departments all over Texas, the Ozona police depended on the DPS crime lab for forensic services. This time, though, the Department of Public Safety came up empty. The coin box fingerprint didn't match anything they had on
back up a little. Yeah, I mean,
News
that's
of
good.
Dean Phillips' death spread through Ozona. Crockett County Chief Deputy Sheriff Alton Davis was determined to catch the criminal who had shattered the quiet of this little town.
We've got a population of probably 3,000 to 4,000 people, so it's a small town. Everybody knows everybody, and it was a real shock to the community that something like this could happen in Ozona.
The community stepped forward to help the investigation. A witness reported seeing two local men wearing bloody clothes the night Phillips was killed.
Back. Yeah, when I move my hand from you.
Clothes were confiscated before they had time to launder them. Brought in for questioning, the men claimed they were hunters and that the blood was from a deer they had poached. Investigators were skeptical until they got confirmation from the DPS crime lab. The blood was indeed from a deer. And the men's fingerprints didn't match the one lifted from the coin box at Phillips's laundry. The case's first promising tip amounted to nothing. A clerk at a convenience store right off the interstate gave investigators their next lead. A man came in an hour before the murder and asked where the laundrette was. She described him as stocky, with dirty blonde hair and a t-shirt with radio call letters. He drove a beat-up blue van with a green door on the passenger side. There may have been a passenger in the van. Investigators hope to see the suspect on the store's surveillance tape.
Good. Okay. So you have a good evening. Thanks a lot.
But the security camera was old. The man's face was a blur. Neither the DPS nor the FBI could enhance the image electronically. The investigators were convinced they had their suspect on this tape, but his image, like their chances of finding him, were dimmed. As the investigation into the murder of Dean Phillips continued, witnesses reported seeing a strange blue van in town the night of the murder. Some thought they saw two people in it. Sheriff Alton Davis believed that Phillips's killer was a stranger just passing through town.
Ozona is right on Interstate 10, more or less out in the middle of nowhere. This is the first one we've had where someone has came off the interstate and murdered one of our local people.
Investigators knew the killer was probably hundreds of miles away by now. Then they got the call. A van matching the one described by the witnesses was stopped about 200 miles west of town. Davis sped to the scene.
We found an old GMC van, light blue, that had a dark passenger door on it, dark primer colored. And we took photographs of the van. We talked to there was a Hispanic male driving it, which didn't fit the description of our suspect.
The case had run into another dead end. Reviewing the clues they'd gathered so far, investigators realized that all they had to go on was a blurry surveillance tape and a store clerk's fading recollection. They needed some way to turn these hazy clues into solid information. Then they recalled Karen Taylor, an experienced forensic artist with the Special Crimes Service of the Texas DPS. Taylor had worked with the Ozona police on missing persons cases. She is a pioneer in the forensic art and science of facial reconstruction, developing witnesses' vague descriptions into recognizable faces of criminal suspects.
My function is to take some bit of information from a crime that occurs, produce some sort of a visual image that can be put out in the media, and hopefully it will trigger additional information that can be used to connect the crime to the victim or connect the crime to the suspect.
Ozona police sent Taylor stills taken from the videotape. But after she had evaluated the black and white photos, she wasn't sure she'd be able to help.
So I had to look at those stills to see just what I could determine about the face. It was very blurry. The quality was pretty poor. So I could see that there wasn't much likelihood we could enhance that video electronically. And it would probably boil down to my trying to just do some sort of a sketch based on what I could see.
Taylor knew that while every feature might not be rendered perfectly, the sketch's resemblance to the suspect would be strong enough to help the investigation.
Well, after years of doing this, I've come to believe that the most important thing to capture in a face for a forensic artist to trigger recognition is getting the proportions right. Each of the component parts in a face, each of the features, the eyes, nose, mouth, is important, but it's not as important as the arrangement of those features on a face.
Taylor wasn't sure the image had enough information for her to work from. Then she noticed a feature she'd overlooked: the store clerk. She had talked with the suspect face to face. Taylor hoped the clerk might provide the missing details she needed to sharpen the picture.
Using the video stills, I prepared as much of a drawing as I could, maybe 85% done, and then faxed it to the witness, got on the phone with her, and she was able to make some changes. She said that she wanted me to make the eyes look light, make the lower face look more slim, and I did that. We hung up. I spent about 15 minutes making those alterations, and then I refaxed it to her, and she checked it and said, yes, that's right. So I was able to get the benefit of her long-distance input over the phone and using the fax.
Here he was, the most likely suspect in the murder of Dean Phillips. The Crockett County Sheriff's Office prepared a crime bulletin. Karen Taylor's drawing of the suspect's face was circulated across the country, and to every radio station where someone might recognize the call letters on the suspect's shirt. Taylor's drawing represented the investigation's last hope. But when all the publicity brought no response, the Dean Phillips murder case came to a dead halt. The beating death of Dean Phillips looked like it was destined to go unsolved. Sheriff Alton Davis and his team had exhausted their last leads.
Eventually, we ruled everybody out we were getting, and the leads stopped coming in, and we didn't have anything to work on, and it just more or less went cold, and we just had to set until we got some other type of leads.
5 years came and went without another clue or lead, but Peggy Phillips was determined to bring her husband's murderer to justice. She contacted a television crime show and asked if they'd run her story. In August 1996, just over 5.5 years after Phillips was killed, the TV show aired the story of his murder and featured Karen Taylor's drawing. That's what got the phones ringing. From around the country, viewers called in leads. Texas Ranger Jerry Byrne fielded the calls and directed the investigation. One tip led him to Paul Wesley Taylor, a convict at Utah's minimum security prison in Draper. Ranger Byrne contacted Draper Prison and asked for Taylor's records and a photograph. When he saw it, Byrne felt that at last they had tracked down their suspect.
The photograph of Paul Wesley Taylor was nearly identical to a composite drawing that a DPS artist had conducted back in 1991. Initially, I felt like it was too good to be true.
Byrne sent Taylor's records and fingerprint card to the DPS. They matched Taylor's right ring finger with the coin box fingerprint. After years without progress, this was a giant step forward. Investigators went back to the original set of clues, looking for more connections to the suspect. They found out that Taylor's brother worked at a radio station with the call letters seen on Taylor's shirt. They were now certain Paul Wesley Taylor was involved with the murder of Dean Phillips. But they wanted to know about the van's passenger, a witness, or possibly an accomplice to Phillips's murder. Taylor's arrest records showed that his girlfriend had been with him at the time of his arrest in Georgia. Georgia authorities located the woman. Her answers filled the remaining gaps in the case against Taylor. She told Ranger Byrne that they had traveled through Texas during December 1990, and that Taylor had pulled up outside of a laundrette and gone in. She saw him fighting. He returned to the van with blood on his shirt. She certainly didn't know that anyone had been killed. She led investigators to a field where Taylor had ditched his bloody clothes, along with a stolen coin box. They now had a credible witness who placed Taylor in the laundrette at the time of the murder. Utah extradited Paul Wesley Taylor back to Texas. On September 15, 1998, nearly 8 years after the killing, he pled guilty to the capital murder of Dean Phillips. On the 21st, he was sentenced to life in prison. Forensic artist Karen Taylor had turned a single blurry photograph into an image that helped unmask and apprehend a bald-faced killer.
When that photograph and drawing were presented, they knew that it was Paul Wesley Taylor. That photograph and that composite drawing is what broke this case open.
Investigators speculate that Paul Wesley Taylor got off the interstate in Ozona to get some food and gas. Short of money, Taylor got the idea to knock over the laundrette after closing time. Dean Phillips was in the wrong place at the wrong time. In other cases, tragedy stalks its victims. August 16, 1989, Joe Gilbreth finished work and arrived at his home in Villanelle, Georgia. He was looking forward to spending the evening with his baby girl, Amber, and his wife, Nikia. He noticed that his wife's car was gone. This was odd. Nikia was usually home fixing supper at this hour. When he went inside, he started to worry. Nikia would never let Amber sit in her pajamas all day, and there was no way she'd ever leave the baby in the house by herself. The doors were unlocked. It didn't look like they had been tampered with. When Nikia's family told Joe they hadn't heard from her, he called the police. The Walker County Sheriff's Department sent officers to investigate. Joe and his mother-in-law reported 3 missing items. A telephone cord that had been ripped from the wall. A bedspread that had a sheet stitched to one side. And all of Nikia's underwear. Based on what he found in the house, Detective Pat Bedford believed that Nikia Gilbreth's disappearance was more sinister than the simple missing persons case he was originally sent to investigate.
My first impressions are, she was taken out here bound. Somebody fortunately was taking her from this residence. When you tie that into the fact that it was realized that a whole drawer full of her undergarments and lingerie was missing, makes you think that we're dealing with one of the serious crime here.
Check around, see if there's anything missing by chance.
Joe Gilbreth told the police that the day had started like any other.
They checked all the houses.
The alarm went off at 5:30. Joe got up and got ready for work. Nikia went back to bed. And by 6 a.m., the house was quiet. Joe and the baby were the last to have seen Nikia. The squad car was stationed at the house in case she might return. But Nikia never came home. On August 18, 1989, the day after she had disappeared, the Walker County Sheriff's Department had little to go on.
We got a tragedy here. We got a problem. At first, no good leads to follow up on. Her car had not been located. She had not been located. Didn't appear to have any leads from talking to neighbors and searching the immediate area. We had nothing at that point.
But that soon changed when Nikia's mother found her daughter's car abandoned on a logging road half a mile north of the Gilbreth house. Investigators hoped they'd find clues to help locate her. Technicians raised fingerprints all over the car, but they belonged to members of the Gilbreth family. Officers found indications of a second car parked next to Nikia's. It was an ominous sign, but the tire impression wasn't distinct enough to photograph or print. Nikia's mother noted that the baby quilt Nikia always kept in the back seat was missing. And that was it. Nothing at the scene offered a clue of what had happened to Nikia or where she might be now. Still, her family held out hope that she'd come back to them unharmed. Though investigators believed she was a victim of foul play, they had no evidence and no suspects. Joe had passed a polygraph, indicating that he wasn't involved. All they had were a few missing items and an abandoned car, but still no sign of Nikia. Two days later, a boy collecting empty cans along the highway made a crucial, gruesome discovery. was too decomposed for a constant visual ID, though it was a white female of Nakia's size, with the clothes and jewelry Joe had described. Dental records confirmed everyone's worst fears. The autopsy determined that Nakia had died from asphyxiation. The examination also revealed marks around her wrists and ankles, marks that could have been made with telephone cord. But there was no other significant forensic evidence. No hairs or fibers, no fingerprints on the body. Nothing that might dictate the investigation's next step. Investigators considered a number of suspects, but none of them panned out. Leads dried up. The case went cold.
Unfortunately, we were going nowhere in the case. We had no good leads, no good suspects. Any tips that we got, we did everything from roadblocks, car to car, house to house, door